Welcome. Tonight, we begin far from the palaces and marble halls of power. Imagine, instead, the hush of snow on wooden roofs, the quiet creak of pine trees bending under the weight of frost, and the slow, steady breath of a village at rest. Let your mind ease into the winter world of Western Siberia, in a time before electricity, before modernity, before the great unraveling of empires. The year is 1872. The village of Pokrovskoye lies along the banks of the Tura River, surrounded by wide fields and forests that stretch toward the horizon like a sea of dark green and grey. Life here is not rushed. It is shaped by the earth, by planting and harvest, by snowmelt and sunrise. The air is cold and pure, thick with the scent of pine, wood smoke, and damp soil. Footsteps in the snow don't echo. They are swallowed into silence. There is a peace here, though not an easy one. Imagine waking early, before the sun has properly risen. The light outside is pale, silvered by frost. Inside a small wooden house, the warmth of the hearth battles the chill that creeps in through the chinks in the walls. The fire crackles gently. A pot of kasha simmers. Woolen garments, thick with the scent of lanolin, hang near the heat to dry. In the corner, icons of saints glow faintly in the flicker of the flame focal points of devotion. Reminders of the divine in this simple life. Villagers rise with the sun and rest with its setting. There is little variation. Men tend to livestock or haul timber. Women carry water, knead dough, men clothing by the flickering light of a single candle. The church bell rings to mark the hours of prayer. Its toll is slow, rounded more a vibration than a sound. And when the snow falls, as it so often does, it falls thickly, muting the world in softness. It is not a life of leisure, but one of pattern, of repetition, of quiet dignity. In this world, literacy is rare, but stories abound, passed down through song, prayer, whispered cautionary tales. Some speak of saints who bled for others, some of wolves with human eyes, some of strangers who walked the land with healing in their touch and fire in their words. It is into this mixture of hardship, belief, and myth that a child is born, Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin. There is no storm to mark his birth, no comet overhead, no midwife's gasp at a strange mark upon his skin. Just the usual hush of a winter morning. His family is of the land, as are all those around them peasants, surviving not through wealth or privilege, but through endurance. His father, Yefim, is a farmer, an occasional courier. He is known as a quiet man, hard-working, rarely idle. His mother, Anna, we know less about, only that she bore several children, many of whom did not survive infancy. Such loss was not unusual in Pokrovskoye. Grigory grows up amid this steady rhythm of life, the village, the river, the ever wheel of the seasons. He is not especially strong, nor is he considered handsome, but from early on, there are those who notice something peculiar about him. He stares longer than other children do. He asks questions not suited to his age, and there is a stillness in him, an inner pause, as though listening for something no one else can hear. No one calls him gifted, not yet. He is simply different. In a land where the soil was often frozen solid half the year, the inner life of a person could be the warmest thing they owned. Grigory Rasputin grew in stature, but he also grew in stillness. As a child, he was not known for academic excellence. Indeed, he would remain mostly illiterate well into adulthood, but the villagers in Pokrovskoye began to notice him for something else entirely, a presence, a kind of unspoken gravity. He listened more than he spoke. He watched animals in the fields with quiet fascination, and when he did speak, it was with an unusual calm, often accompanied by observations that felt just a little too knowing. But life in Pokrovskoy didn't reward inner contemplation. It rewarded hard work, obedience, and ritual. The Russian Orthodox Church permeated everything. Its services were long, its priests stern, and its icons ever. There was very little room in this tight weave of tradition for unusual boys with faraway eyes. Still, Rasputin grew, and like many young men of the village, he married early. His wife, Praskovia Dubrovina, was quiet and devout. She bore him children. Theirs was a household of routine, modest but stable. They had a small garden, a stove that cracked in winter, a handful of animals to tend. From the outside, it was a life like any other in their village, but inside, something stirred in Grigory. Some biographies suggest that the change began after the death of several of his siblings. Others claim it was illness, or guilt from some unknown sin, or simply a restless spirit. Whatever the cause, one day he left. He said little to explain why, only that he needed to walk, to pray, to understand. And so began what would become the defining rhythm of his early adult life, the pilgrimage. Imagine, for a moment, walking out of your village with nothing but a bundle, a heavy coat, and the conviction that something greater waited beyond the forests. Rasputin walked on foot across miles of desolate landscape, seeking out monasteries and holy men, knocking on doors, not for shelter, but for insight. He wasn't seeking doctrinal clarity. His questions were less about theology than they were about divine experience. What does it mean to be close to God? Can suffering cleanse the soul? Why does spiritual ecstasy often feel like pain? His journeys took him to the Verkhoturye Monastery, one of the oldest and most remote in the region. There he met monks who lived austere, silent lives. He watched, he listened, he asked, but he did not join. Something in the ritualism, the rigidity of formal religion, made him uneasy. Rasputin was drawn to something less structured, more immediate. The idea that God could be felt through the body as well as the spirit, that tears and sweat and even sin might serve as a gateway to the divine. It was around this time that he began hearing whispers of a mystical sect known as the Klists. Their full name, Klistov, derived from a word meaning whip, and though their practices were secretive, they were rumored to believe in salvation through ecstatic ritual, chanting, dancing, even purposeful transgression, followed by deep repentance. There's no firm proof Rasputin ever formally joined them, but the echoes of their teachings can be found in his later philosophy. The idea that closeness to God was not something achieved through purity alone, but through total surrender, followed by redemption. When Rasputin returned to Pokrovskoy, he was changed. He was thinner. Certainly pilgrimage did not lend itself to luxury, but he was also quieter, more centered. He stopped eating meat. He fasted for long periods. He claimed to have visions, and the villagers, who once saw him as merely odd, began to see him as something more, a starutz. This word, often mistranslated as monk, actually describes a lay spiritual elders, someone not ordained by the church, but whose wisdom and presence draw others to seek their guidance. Rasputin became known as a man who could offer blessings, advice, even healing. People came from neighboring villages to see him. They brought sick children, troubled marriages, and long-answered prayers. He did not heal in the conventional sense. There were no potions, no elaborate rites. Instead, he prayed. He spoke softly. He laid hands gently on the afflicted. He would sometimes lock eyes with a person and speak as though he was seeing into their past. He had no formal training, but what he did have was conviction, presence, and a calm that disarmed doubt. And so the reputation grew, not among the upper classes, at least not yet, but among the peasants, who were hungry for signs, for hope, for anything that made them feel less powerless in the face of crop failures, disease, or loss. Rasputin didn't promise miracles. He simply made people feel heard. And in a world that was often brutally indifferent, that alone was enough. By the early 1900s, his name had reached Kazan, a university town more sophisticated and skeptical than Pokrovskoy. There, Rasputin met clergy and academics who were alternately amused, intrigued, and disturbed by him. Some dismissed him as a rustic curiosity. Others saw something deeper. Still others were simply fascinated by the contrast this wild-eyed man with tangled hair and peasant boots, calmly discussing scripture and divine vision with scholars in polished rooms. He was never entirely welcomed, but he was never entirely rejected either. He lingered on the fringes, always moving, always listening. He wrote letters to those who showed him kindness. He scribbled prayers. He continued to wander, and then, one day, someone in Kazan suggested he travel farther still to St. Petersburg, the capital, the beating heart of Imperial Russia, a place so far removed from Pokrovskoy that it might as well have been another planet. But Rasputin, who had walked through forests for weeks with nothing but conviction, did not hesitate. He packed what little he had, and once again he set off. Not yet a legend, not yet infamous, just a man with strange eyes, a growing following, and the quiet, powerful belief that his journey was only just beginning. By the time Rasputin set his worn boots upon the icy cobblestones of St. Petersburg, the year was 1904. The city Imperial Russia's cold, gilded heart breathed with a strange combination of reverence and instability. It was a place where centuries of monarchy still loomed over streets already beginning to echo with the murmurs of revolution. A place where chandeliers sparkled above salons, even as hunger scratched at the edges of tenement walls. Rasputin, the peasant from Pokrovskoy, arrived not with pomp, but with purpose. Imagine him now, unshaven, eyes deep with long road weariness, entering the capital that had swallowed many before him. His clothes were modest, perhaps even shabby. His beard long, his manner quiet but not submissive. In most accounts, he gave off an aura of undeniable presence. He stood out precisely because he did not try to blend in. Where others bowed and curtsied, Rasputin moved simply, honestly, and seemingly without fear. And in a court so obsessed with decorum and image, that in itself was disarming. St. Petersburg was no place for mystics, at least not in theory, but in practice it was full of them. The imperial court, especially under Empress Alexandra, was deeply religious, bordering on superstitious. The empress, German-born, emotionally isolated, and burdened with guilt over her son Alexia's fragile condition, had long sought solace in spirituality. She hosted mystics, healers, and holy men. Most came and went. None seemed to offer the comfort she so desperately needed. Then came Rasputin. He had been introduced to members of the church and nobility through mutual connections who found him curious and unorthodox, but persuasive. He met with bishops, lower-tier royals, and eventually someone whispered his name to the empress. She was skeptical but intrigued. And when Rasputin was finally brought before her, the impact was immediate. Alexandra Fyodorovna was many things: devout, intelligent, and fiercely protective of her children. But she was also isolated, culturally and emotionally. Her husband, Tsar Nicholas II, was loving but distracted by affairs of state. Her court ladies viewed her with suspicion. Her son's hemophilia, the disease that could turn a stumble into a life-threatening hemorrhage, haunted her every moment. She was vulnerable, and she was waiting for a sign. And Rasputin, standing quietly with his piercing stare and slow, deliberate speech, became that sign. Accounts differ on exactly what happened when he met the Tsarevich Alexei. But one truth remains consistent: the boy's bleeding stopped. Whether by coincidence, calm influence, or an as yet unexplained method of easing the child's pain, Rasputin brought relief where countless physicians had failed to the Empress. It was nothing short of divine intervention, and so Rasputin entered the royal orbit not as a courtier, not as a nobleman, but as something entirely different. He was allowed into rooms few had access to. He spoke to the Empress in private. He was consulted on matters of the family's well-being. He wrote her letters, some simple, others bordering on intimate in tone, calling her Mama, signing, "As your humble servant." The relationship was spiritual, deeply emotional, and depending on who you asked, dangerously influential. Nicholas II, though more reserved, accepted Rasputin for one reason: when the peasant mystic was around, his son got better. That alone seemed to validate everything, but the rest of the court did not feel the same. To nobles and clergy alike, Rasputin was a walking contradiction. He wore simple robes, but spoke with confidence. He had no education, but gave spiritual advice. He eschewed formal religion, but seemed to wield divine power. Rumors took root of debauchery, drunkenness, and immoral acts. He was accused of seducing noble women, of manipulating the Empress, of using hypnotic control. Some called him a devil, others merely a fraud. But Rasputin remained, in part because he understood how to navigate suspicion. He would disappear from the palace for days or weeks, returning to the countryside or the monasteries. He reminded those around him that he did not desire wealth or titles only to serve. And when Alexei's condition worsened, it was Rasputin's name they called. His influence, whether perceived or real, became a source of national debate. Pamphlets circulated. Satirical cartoons portrayed him as a puppet master, controlling the Tsarina like a marionette. Political enemies of the Romanovs saw in Rasputin a symbol of everything wrong with the monarchy: blind loyalty, misplaced faith, and a refusal to acknowledge decay. Still, Rasputin remained steadfast. He continued to walk barefoot in the snow. As penance, he prayed fervently. He rejected riches, but at the same time, he grew bolder. He gave political advice. He warned against war. He spoke against certain ministers and called others corrupt. Whether his influence directly shaped policy remains debated by historians, but his presence certainly altered perception. Imagine now a palace on the edge of unrest. The Empress clings to Rasputin's letters like sacred relics. The Tsar, beleaguered by a war abroad and revolution at home, leans further into fatalistic faith. And outside, in the streets, whispers become shouts. Bread lines grow, soldiers mutter, the gap between the palace and the people widens, and in that widening chasm, Rasputin becomes not just a man, but a symbol to his followers. He is the last true holy man, to his enemies, the ruin of an empire. Yet in truth, he is still just Rasputin, a mystic, a wanderer, a man who spoke in riddles and walked barefoot through snow. Seeking a god he believed lived not only in the heavens, but in suffering, in ecstasy, and in the trembling hope of a mother kneeling by her child's bed. There is a certain weight to notoriety. Rasputin, by the second decade of the 20th century, carried that weight with every slow, deliberate step he took through the opulent, anxious world of the Russian aristocracy. In candlelit salons, his name was spoken in hushed tones. In the corridors of power, it was spat with contempt. He had risen not by noble blood, nor military rank, nor academic brilliance, but by presence, by healing, by seeming to understand something about life, suffering, and death that others did not. But such power, however intangible, makes enemies. Let us walk now through the twilight of Rasputin's influence. It is the year 1916. War churns endlessly across Europe, and Russia is bleeding. The front lines are muddy graves for thousands of young men. At home, food shortages tighten their grip. Revolts simmer, and revolutionary sentiment boils. In the midst of this, Rasputin remains at the center of imperial gravities, till a confidant to Alexandra, still a shadowed figure behind the closed doors of the royal household. Imagine the mood within the Romanov palace, tense, fatigued, burdened by bad news from the front and worsening unrest in the streets. The Empress grows increasingly dependent on Rasputin's calming letters and presence. Nicholas, ever distant from political maneuvering, is pulled deeper into her orbit. To outsiders, it seems as though a man once mocked for his rags and riddles is now a secret advisor to the throne, and that, for many, is unacceptable. Among Rasputin's most fervent critics were those within the nobility men who saw him as a stain on the monarchy's dignity and a danger to its survival. Chief among them, Prince Felix Yusupov, young, wealthy, and married to the Tsar's niece. Yusupov was heir to one of the largest fortunes in Russia, but despite his charm and social status, he harbored deep resentment toward Rasputin, whom he blamed for the collapse of public faith in the Romanovs. Yusupov was not alone. He conspired with a small group of like-minded individuals, among them Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, a cousin of the Tsar, and a conservative politician named Vladimir Poriskovich. Their plan was simple, but chilling, to end Rasputin's influence. They would end Rasputin himself. Let us pause here not to recount the murder in gory detail, but to understand the eerie choreography of it all. The night was cold, December 30th, by the new calendar, 1916. Rasputin was invited to Yusupov's palace under the pretense of meeting Felix's wife, Irina, who was said to be curious about the infamous mystic. The story was a fabrication. Irina was not even in St. Petersburg that evening. In the basement of the palace, wine and pastries laced with cyanide were prepared. A gramophone played cheerful music. The conspirators waited upstairs, but as the minutes stretched into an hour, something unsettling happened. Rasputin did not die. He ate the cakes, sipped the poisoned wine, but showed no signs of distress. Yusupov, unnerved, left and returned with a revolver. He shot Rasputin once, some say in the chest, others in the side. The mystic collapsed. But the story does not end there. What happened next has become part of Rasputin's myth. According to Yusupov's later account, Rasputin stirred. He opened his eyes. He attempted to flee. In the snow-covered courtyard, more shots were fired. Finally, bound and bloodied, Rasputin's body was cast into the freezing Neva River. In the days that followed, the murder was discovered. The Empress was devastated. Nicholas was heartbroken, but politically cornered. The assassins, far from being punished harshly, were exiled or quietly pardoned, an indication of just how much support there was for Rasputin's removal. But something shifted in the air after Rasputin's death. Far from stabilizing the monarchy, the act only deepened the fractures. Within 3 months, the Russian Revolution would erupt in full. Nicholas II would abdicate. The royal family would be imprisoned. Within 2 years, they too would be executed, their fate sealed in part by the very chaos Rasputin's enemies had hoped to prevent. And Rasputin, his legend only grew. Imagine now that freezing riverbank, still and silent. Somewhere beneath the ice, the body of a man whose life straddled the sacred and the profane. The mystical and the political drifted in death as he had once wandered in life. He was not a general, nor a scholar, nor a statesman, but his presence had shaped the final days of a centuries-old empire. The snow never really stops in Siberian, truly. It drifts like memory, soft but relentless, and it settles into the cracks of time itself. When Rasputin's body was pulled from the Neva River in early January 1917, his physical presence left the world, but the story of his life, the questions, the awe, the revulsion had only just begun to take root. What happens to a man when he becomes myth? What remains when truth is buried beneath fascination and fear? Let us now turn our gaze from the real corridors of the Tsar's palace to the imagined ones, the collective memory and mystery that Rasputin left behind. It began almost immediately after his death, despite the political volatility of the times. Newspapers, both Russian and foreign, ran sensational headlines. The mad monk murdered, some proclaimed, others asked, was Rasputin immortal? Rumors poured from every corner of society that Rasputin had been poisoned, stabbed, shot, clubbed, and drowned, and still fought to live, that his eyes had remained open underwater, that his body had shown signs of movement when found. Most of these stories were exaggerations, some outright fabrications, but they spoke to something deeper than journalistic curiosity. They revealed a need, perhaps even a hunger, to turn Rasputin into something more than he was. Not merely a man who advised a royal family, but a vessel of ancient power, a symbol, a monster, a martyr, depending on who was telling the tale. His daughter, Maria Rasputin, who would later flee Russia and eventually settle in the United States, attempted to soften his image. In interviews and books, she painted him as a gentle, misunderstood soul, a man who loved his children, prayed with sincerity, and healed the desperate. She claimed that his intentions were always pure, even if his methods were unconventional. Her accounts are heartfelt, but not without their own contradictions, shaped by time, memory, and the human tendency to protect the dead we love. Others were not so kind in the years following the Russian Revolution. Emigres fleeing Bolshevik rule carried with them a burning need to explain what had gone so wrong. Rasputin, with his peasant roots, his controversial behavior, and his closeness to the Romanovs, became a convenient scapegoat. He was cast as the corrupting force that had weakened the monarchy, a puppet master, a seducer, a devil in monks' robes. Western writers, enthralled by the exoticism of a mystic monk influencing a royal court, added layers to the myth. Books published in Paris, London, and New York turned Rasputin into a figure of dark glamour. Artists painted him with wild eyes and raised hands. Novels reimagined him as a hypnotist, a sorcerer, even an immortal. And the films, from sympathetic portrayals to gothic horror. In some, he is a misunderstood healer. In others, a howling villain who calls down storms and commands fire. But amid the fiction, threads of truth remain. Rasputin was, by all accounts, a man of contradictions. He preached purity, but was accused of licentiousness. He claimed humility, yet reveled in his influence. He healed, yet left chaos in his wake. To understand him fully may be impossible, but to observe how the world has tried is revealing. Consider, for example, the lingering presence of Rasputin in popular culture. His name appears in music, in literature, in internet folklore. The 1978 disco song by Boney M., absurd and catchy, made his name familiar to new generations. Rasputin, Russia's greatest love machine, a song that trivialized the very real consequences of his life, but also ensured he would not be forgotten. Academic historians have, in recent decades, attempted to sift through the layers of myth and present a more balanced view. Some portray him as a charismatic faith healer who sincerely believed in his gift. Others see him as an opportunist who learned to manipulate those in power. But most agree on one point: Rasputin's influence was reland. So was the fear it inspired in his enemies. Perhaps that's the heart of the matter. Rasputin existed at the edge of worlds, between peasantry and nobility, between religious devotion and personal indulgence, between belief and blasphemy. In an empire riddled with tension, spiritual, political, social, he embodied the contradictions that would eventually tear it apart. Imagine, if you will, a candle burning low in a snow-covered room. The flame dances, fragile but defiant, casting long shadows on ancient icons. Outside, the empire groans and cracks. Inside, a figure kneels in prayer, whispering to a god only he seems to hear. That is Rasputin, not the monster or the saint, but the mystery. In the early 20th century, Russia was not one country, but two. One was gilded and glowing, defined by marble floors, chandeliers, and the rustle of silk gowns in drawing rooms. The other was built of earth and smoke, defined by wooden huts, aching hands, and the sharp sting of winter that could enter through even the smallest cracks. Rasputin belonged to the second world, yet moved freely in the first. His presence in the imperial court was not just strange, it was a quiet rebellion against the deep, unspoken rules that had governed Russian life for centuries. Let us wander for a moment into the countryside where Rasputin was born. Here, the rhythm of life was older than memory. Days were structured not by clocks, but by the sun's path across the sky. People woke with the light, worked with their hands, and turned to rest long after the candles had gone out. They shared beds in crowded rooms, lived by the harvest, and depended on one another for survival. In Pokrovskoy and villages like it, hunger was not an occasional fear, it was a known season. Bread was stretched, potatoes boiled without salt, and families made do with less. Disease came with the thaw and lingered into the cold. Childbirth was dangerous. Winters could kill. Yet within all this struggle, there was also a closeness, a unity built from enduring the same hardships together. Peasants lived in a world of signs and superstitions. Church teachings mingled with folk beliefs. Icons were kissed with reverence, but so too were trees avoided if deemed unlucky. A bird tapping on a window was an omen. A dream could be a warning. Life was mysterious, and mystery was sacred. Rasputin was shaped by this worldview. He grew up among people who believed the spiritual world was always close, just behind the surface of the visible one. It gave him a language of symbols, of stories. and a sense that truth was not always logical, but felt, intuited, sensed. Now contrast this with the St. Petersburg court. Inside the Winter Palace, life was dictated by etiquette, ritual, and appearances. Nobles changed clothes several times a day. Servants stood at attention for hours, silent and still. Conversations were polite, restrained. Emotions, especially strong ones, were kept under control. The women of court spoke French more often than Russian. They read European literature, hosted salons, and discussed ideas drawn from philosophy and science. Religion was practiced, yes, but with a formality that dulled its fire. Faith was a matter of ceremony, not sensation. Into this world walked Rasputin, a man who smelled of the earth, who spoke in riddles and stared too long, who touched without permission and said what others would not. His beard was too wild, his eyes too intense. He crossed lines others had spent lifetimes avoiding. And yet, the Romanovs welcomed him. They did not just tolerate his presence, they invited it to many aristocrats. This was unthinkable. A man of no noble blood, no education, no manners, offering counsel to the Empress. It was not simply scandalous, it was terrifying. It meant the old rules no longer applied. And when rules collapse, so do the walls that keep fear at bay. Rasputin's presence revealed the weaknesses of the elite. They were deeply vulnerable, not just politically, but emotionally. The Tsarina, isolated in her role, overwhelmed by her son's illness, craved connection and certainty. The Tsar, indecisive and overburdened, clung to familiar comforts. And so Rasputin, with his simple confidence and spiritual certainty, filled a void that no nobleman could dot. It wasn't just his words that mattered. It was his embodiment of something ancient, something the court had forgotten. Rasputin represented a Russia that was older than empire, deeper than diplomacy. His muddy boots left prints on the palace floors, and in doing so, reminded everyone that beneath the marble was dirt. Servants at court whispered about him. They watched as he walked without fear past guards and into private chambers. Some swore. They saw him stare down generals, unflinching. Others believed he had power real, power to see through lies, to heal with touch, to summon or stop pain with nothing but a murmur. And so, belief clung to him. Belief, not proof. That was his strength. Yet belief is also dangerous. In Rasputin's case, it became a wedge, driving the imperial family further from the aristocracy and from the people. The elite saw him as a symptom of decline. The peasants, when they heard of him, were divided. Some believed in his holiness, others resented his audacity, and in between stood the revolution, waiting. But before that revolution erupted, life continued, strangely balanced. Rasputin held no official position, yet had influence. He had no wealth, yet received gifts. He had no training, yet gave orders. And still, he remained outside the system, like a spirit haunting the machinery of a crumbling world. The court tried to contain him. They wrote reports, gathered evidence, debated among themselves. But the Tsarina dismissed their concerns. Too. Her Rasputin was more than a man. He was a blessing, a sign, perhaps even a messenger of God. And so, the two Russias remained at odds, one ruled by bloodlines and protocols, the other by intuition and prayer. Rasputin straddled them both, and in doing so reflected their fractures. By 1911, Rasputin's name was known far beyond the gilded rooms of the Winter Palace. It echoed through the dining halls of aristocratic homes, murmured behind lace fans at ballet intermissions, hissed between clenched teeth in government offices. The mystic from Siberia had become something else, entirely an object of obsession, of speculation, of fear. Not all of the rumors were new. Some had been circulating since his earliest days in Kazana, about his wandering hands, his wandering eyes, his wandering soul. But now they found new life and broader audiences. Gossip columns veiled their accusations in clever metaphor. Pamphlets distributed in secret offered more brazen claims. They spoke of orgies disguised as prayer meetings, of secret rites performed in candlelit parlors, of midnight visits to the Empress's chambers. Most of it was hearsay, but hearsay can be more corrosive than truth when whispered often enough. What did Rasputin actually do behind closed doors? That is difficult to say with certainty. We know he continued to visit the Romanovs, particularly Empress Alexandra. Their correspondence, preserved in archives, shows an emotional intimacy that unnerved many. She wrote to him as a spiritual guide, a father figure, even a beloved friend. Her language was tender, filled with gratitude and trust. He responded in kind, assuring her of God's protection, offering words of comfort, and gently steering her decisions. To the public, however, this intimacy was proof of impropriety. No woman, they said, would write such letters to a mere peasant unless there was more to the relationship. No man would respond so boldly unless he had something to gain. And so the rumors grew. They entwined with politics, with theology, with anxiety about a world that felt increasingly unmored. At the same time, Rasputin's behavior became harder to defend. He drank more openly. He wandered the streets of St. Petersburg late into the night, accompanied by women of questionable repute. He was seen laughing loudly in public, arguing in taverns, singing strange songs to himself as he walked alone. For a man so deeply associated with the sacred, his public image became increasingly profane. Yet still, he returned to the palace. Still, the Tsarina wrote to him. Still, when Alexia's health faltered, it was Rasputin who was called. And, somehow, the boy would improve. The bleeding would stop. His fever would fall. The court physicians were baffled. Some believed it was coincidence. Others suspected Rasputin employed calming techniques, lowering the child's blood pressure, through hypnosis or sheer force of presence. Whatever the cause, the result was the same: trust. Alexandra trusted him more than she trusted her doctors, her advisors, perhaps even her own family. Imagine now the world outside the palace. It is a city of cobbled streets and drafty apartments. St. Petersburg is beautiful but hard. Cold winds whip through alleyways. Coal smoke lingers in the air. The gap between rich and poor yawns wider each year. Bread lines grow longer. Strikes erupt. Protests simmer. The Tsar is increasingly absent, retreating from public life as the pressure mounts. The Duma, Russia's fledgling parliament, attempts to assert control, but finds itself blocked by imperial will. Into this fragile system steps Rasputin, unaccountable and untouchable. Government ministers begin to take notice. Some resign in protest. Others stay, but seethe in silence. They see Rasputin not as a healer, but as a corrupter, a man whose influence weakens the throne, undermines policy, and exposes the empire to mockery. One minister writes in his journal, "Russia is not ruled by the Tsar, nor by the people, but by a mad monk in dirty boots." The press, increasingly emboldened, begins to print caricatures. Rasputin is drawn with animal features, fong's claws, a serpentine tongue. He is shown whispering into Alexandra's ear, holding the crown in his grubby hands, grinning as the empire burns behind him. These images, though fictional, shape perception. They offer a simple narrative. Russia is failing, and Rasputin is to blame. Some of Rasputin's defenders argued that he was never truly political, that his influence was exaggerated, that he offered spiritual guidance, not policy. But politics is not only made in parliaments and courts, it is made in minds. And in the minds of many, Rasputin had become the shadow ruler, the dark force behind the throne. This perception had consequences. It isolated the Romanovs further. Alexandra, once aloof, became defensive and withdrawn. Nicholas, cautious by nature, grew more reliant on her counsel. And when she relayed Rasputin's opinions about ministers, about generals, about the direction of the war efforts, those opinions carried weight. It didn't matter whether Rasputin asked for this. Power, he had it. His enemies began to plot. They spoke in code, in guarded rooms, in carriages that rocked through icy streets. They could not act openly. He was still protected by the Empress. But they could wait. They could gather evidence, build alliances, find a moment, and all the while Rasputin moved through this world as if untouched. He laughed, he wept, he prayed, he vanished for days at a time, then returned as if nothing had happened. He embraced beggars and dined with nobles. He muttered to himself and laid hands on the sick. He remained both present and absent, real and mythical. He did not believe he could be harmed. Whether this was faith or arrogance is unclear, but he believed that God had placed him where he was, and that no man could move him. It was, perhaps, his greatest strength, and his fatal flaw. As the year 1914 dawned, the clouds of war gathered swiftly over Europe, and soon Russia found itself swept into the tides of conflict that would become the First World War. For the Romanovs, the war was a chance to unite the people under a common cause. For the people, it quickly became a crucible of suffering. Millions of Russian men were conscripted into battle, often poorly equipped, led by aristocratic officers who had little understanding of the front lines, and sent against an enemy that was more modern, more prepared, and, often, more successful. The cities emptied of working men, leaving their families behind to face rising food prices, crumbling infrastructure, and shortages of basic necessities. Factories strained to produce arms. Bread became harder to find. Protests and strikes, once sporadic, became regular. The fabric of society began to fray, and the palace, already detached, seemed farther away than ever before. Rasputin, meanwhile, remained in St. Petersburg. He had no role in the military, no expertise in governance, and yet his presence became even more significant. When Nicholas made the fateful decision in 1915 to leave the capital and take direct command of the army at the front, he left behind a power vacuum, one that Empress Alexandra filled. And behind Alexandra stood Rasputin. Imagine a palace now ruled from within by a deeply religious woman, grieving the suffering of her son, terrified by the upheaval beyond the gates, and guided by a man whose wisdom came not from books or formal education, but from visions and intuition. Ministers came and went. Some were dismissed at Rasputin's urging, others resigned in frustration. The inner workings of government, never stable, became unpredictable, even chaotic. Letters between Rasputin and Alexandra during this period reveal a relationship both intimate and codependent. She relied on his assurances. He calmed her when she was distraught. He advised on appointments, spoke of treason, warned of dark forces. Whether he sought this influence or simply accepted it is difficult to discern. But influence he had. Rasputin's enemies multiplied. The aristocracy, already distrustful of his peasant origins and his strange charisma, now saw him as a danger to the entire empire. Senior members of the clergy expressed concern over his morality. Members of the Duma openly questioned his role in state decisions. Foreign ambassadors sent cables home describing the strange hold he had over the empress, often with a tone of bewildered alarm. Yet to Rasputin, the war was not a battlefield of soldiers and strategy, but of souls. He spoke often of divine punishment, of Russia's need to suffer in order to be purified. He warned that revolution was coming, not from the enemy outside, but from within. He begged the Tsar and Empress to listen, to reform, to find humility. But his warnings were laced with contradictions, and his behavior remained erratic. He would host lavish dinners one evening and visit a hospital the next. He offered charity to the poor, prayed with the sick, and then stumbled drunk through the streets before dawn. There were those who still believed in him, peasants, who saw him as a holy man, mystics who called him a prophet. But to the educated elite, he was a national embarrassment, a scandal that threatened the monarchy's last shred of credibility, and yet the bond with Alexandra remained unbroken. She defended him fiercely, even as rumors swirled around her. She believed, truly and deeply, that he was sent by God to protect her son and guide Russia through its trials. To question Rasputin was to question divine providence. This belief, sincere as it may have been, isolated her further. Her German heritage made her an object of suspicion, particularly during the war against Germany. Rasputin's continued presence only deepened the mistrust. The image of a foreign-born empress and a Siberian mystic guiding the empire became a symbol of everything that was wrong in the eyes of the public. Meanwhile, Rasputin's health began to wane. He was attacked in 1914, stabbed by a former follower in the stomach. The wound was severe, and for weeks it was believed he might not survive, but he did, and when he recovered, he seemed changed. More somber at times, more erratic at others. He spoke of death more often. He predicted that he would be killed by nobles, and that if he died at their hands, the Romanovs would fall within 2 years. It is a chilling prophecy, made more so by its accuracy, but at the time it was simply another strange utterance from a man who spoke in riddles and parables. The war continued to bleed Russia dry. Cities were restless. Villages were empty. The army was demoralized. The people were hungry, cold, and angry. Revolution no longer seemed inevitable. And in this atmosphere, in the drawing rooms of the disillusioned elite, plans began to form. Quiet plans, deadly plans. In the waning months of 1916, as snow once again buried the rooftops of Petrograd once, St. Petersburg, renamed to sound less German, Russia, teetered on the brink of collapse. The war had turned bitter. The people, starved and desperate, no longer marched in reverence, but in revolt. The nobility, watching their privileges dissolve like frost in spring, sought a scapegoat. And Rasputin, ever present, ever whispered, about stood squarely in their sights, in salons and candlelit dining rooms. The aristocrats spoke not in admiration but in venom. The name Rasputin, once uttered in curiosity or fear, became synonymous with corruption. It was no longer a question of whether he held power, it was assumed. The true question was, how to stop him. Among the conspirators were some of the empire's most prominent nobles. Prince Felix Yusupov, heir to one of the greatest fortunes in Russia, led the charge. Educated in Oxford, flamboyant and theatrical, he claimed to act for the good of the country. With him were Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, cousin to the Tsar, Vladimir Purishkevich, a fiery right-wing politician, and a handful of others, each with their own grievances, their own fears. They did not act rashly. No, this was planned with precision. They understood Rasputin's patterns, his habits. He was a man of contradictions, holy to some, sinful to others. He preached abstinence, yet indulged in wine. He spoke of purity, and was followed by tales of scandal. Still, he was not foolish. He knew he was hated. He knew he was watched. But perhaps he trusted the wrong people. Perhaps he believed himself untouchable. The plot was simple in form, complicated in execution. They would invite Rasputin to Yusupov's palace under the pretense of a private meeting. Yusupov would offer him wine, cakes, conversation, and then, when the moment was right, they would kill him. On the night of December 29th, 1916, Gregorian calendar, Rasputin arrived at the Grand Moika Palace. Snow was falling thickly. The streets were quiet, muffled by the cold. Inside, candles flickered in ornate sconces. A gramophone played faint music. In the basement, where the deed would be done, wine was poured and cakes were laced with poison. Rasputin arrived in good spirits. He had been cautious lately, wary of omens and the behavior of the court. Yet Yusupov's invitation seemed genuine, his demeanor disarming. They talked, they laughed. Rasputin ate the cakes. He drank the wine, and nothing happened. Time passed. The poison cyanide, they say, should have worked quickly. But Rasputin sat there, unaffected. Nervous glances passed between the conspirators. Something was wrong. Or perhaps something was right, something Rasputinian. Panic overtook the plan. Yusupov left the room, returned with a revolver, and shot Rasputin in the chest. He fell. They waited. Minutes passed. Yusupov approached the body, leaned in to confirm the death, and then, according to Yusupov's own account, Rasputin opened his eyes. He lunged. He ran up the stairs, out into the cold courtyard, blood staining the snow. Another shot rang out, and another. Finally, Rasputin collapsed. Even then, unsure of his death, they bound his hands and feet, wrapped his body in a carpet, and dropped him into the frozen Neva River. 3 days later, his body was found. Autopsy reports were murky. Some said he had water in his lungs, suggesting he was still breathing when thrown into the river. Others denied it. The truth, obscured by fear and myth, was already slipping into legend. Word of his murder spread. Quickly, Alexandra was devastated. She blamed the nobles, the traitors. She blamed the rot within. Nicholas, at the front, responded with a mixture of grief and detachment. But the prophecy, Rasputin's dark warning, lingered. If I am killed by common men, you will live. If I am killed by nobles, your family will fall within 2 years. And fall they did. Within months, revolution broke open the gates of Petrograd. Nicholas abdicated. The Romanov dynasty, over 300 years old, was swept away in the tide of red banners and hunger. The palaces emptied. The family was imprisoned. Rasputin, buried and exhumed, burned, erased from official history, remained in memory. A symbol of something lost and something feared. He had no title, no office. He wore no medals. And yet, for a brief moment in history, a peasant from Siberia walked through the heart of an empire, leaving behind footsteps still visible in the snow, long after Rasputin's body vanished beneath the ice of the Neva. His name remains suspended in the air, like smoke from a snuffed-out candle. History moved on brutally, rapidly, with revolutions and wars sweeping away the world he knew. But Rasputin, he lingered, not just in memory, but in whispers, in rumors, in art, and in fear. The man had passed, but the myth had just begun to take shape in the vacuum left by his death and the collapse of the Romanov dynasty. People scrambled to explain what had happened to Russia. How could such a mighty empire fall so quickly? How could a royal family be erased so completely? And inevitably, the answer so many clung to, whether in sincerity or as convenient scapegoating, was Rasputin. He became a symbol of excess, of corruption, of mysticism gone mad. Caricatures appeared in newspapers and magazines, portraying him as a devil with hypnotic eyes, as a puppeteer manipulating the empress, as a mad monk cackling in the corridors of power. None of it truly aligned with the man himself, who had been complex, contradictory, and at times deeply human. But nuance rarely survives the fire of regime change. Meanwhile, the Bolsheviks, having executed the Romanovs in a dark cellar in 1918, sought to erase Rasputin's legacy entirely. He represented the old world, the decadence of the court, the religious fervor that the new regime so vehemently rejected. Icons were pulled down, churches closed, and his story pushed into the margins. Still, it lived on. Travel abroad, and you would hear his name uttered in cabarets and cocktail parties. He became the subject of fascination in the West, especially in a Europe reeling from war and trying to make sense of Russia's sudden, violent transformation. Books were published, most of them sensational. Films followed. His image, twisted and morphed into a monstrous figure, became a tool for storytellers. In the world's imagination, Rasputin became not a man, but a myth, and myths, as we know, are harder to kill than men. Yet amid the exaggerations and the outlandish claims, a quieter truth remained. Those who remembered him truly remembered him, not through filtered lenses, but through lived experience, spoke not of monsters, but of contradiction. Servants in the royal household described him as kind to children, humble, even shy when not the center of attention. Some said he smelled of the earth, of horses and candle wax. Others claimed his prayers truly calmed the Tsarevich, that in the empress's haunted gaze. He was a source of genuine peace. In small villages far from the courts and conspiracies, peasants told different stories. They remembered a man who had once walked barefoot from town to town, blessing the sick, listening to the forgotten. They saw not a villain, but one of their own, someone who had somehow broken through the iron ceiling of Russian class and found himself in rooms where peasants had never been allowed to breathe. Was he gifted? Was he mad? Was he merely lucky? The truth may lie somewhere in between. He was no sorcerer, but he understood people. He read them not like books, but like weather shifting, intuitive. He knew how to speak so that people felt seen. And perhaps that, more than anything, is what made him dangerous in the eyes of the powerful. In the decades that followed, Rasputin's image evolved again. Novels cast him as an anti-hero, a tragic figure undone by forces beyond his control. Documentaries searched for the man behind the myth. Psychologists studied his hold on others. Historians dissected his rise. Spiritualists claimed to channel him. Even today, his story resurfaces again and again on stages, in classrooms and on screens. There is something in him that defies stillness. Perhaps it is the tension between the sacred and the profane, between humility and power, between healing and harm. Or perhaps it is because his story is Russia's story, In miniature, a man torn between the old world and the new, caught in a current too powerful to escape. If you walk today along the Neva River in St. Petersburg, you will see nothing of Rasputin, no statues, no markers. The palace where he met his end is still there, but it tells a different story now. And yet, beneath the cobblestones, beneath the snow, his presence still lingers in the chill of the wind, in the memory of a candle flickering beneath an icon, in the silence of a church long abandoned. And perhaps that is how Rasputin would have wanted it. A man half in shadow, half in light, never fully understood, never fully gone. As Rasputin's place in the imperial court solidified, so too did the sense of unease it generated, not only within the nobility but among the Russian people at large. The whispers that once flitted like dust through back rooms and quiet parlors began to settle into something more substantial. What had started as curiosity about a strange, wild-eyed holy man with healing hands had grown into a brooding suspicion that something was deeply wrong at the very heart of power. Picture St. Petersburg. In the winter of 1914, snow laid like ash across cobbled streets, the grey Neva River crawling beneath a crust of ice, and domes glinting faintly under pale skies. There was a kind of heaviness in the air. The war with Germany had just begun, and its echoes could already be heard in the shifting prices at the market stalls and in the tightened expressions of the men who once walked freely with confidence. Bread became harder to come by. Soldiers became more visible. Conversations, even in private, were shorter, quieter, measured, and amid it all, Rasputin's name became a kind of shadow cast over the throne. He was never formally appointed to any governmental position, never officially granted the powers so many claimed he wielded, and yet ministers found themselves dismissed after angering him. Proposals were altered or scrapped if they drew his disapproval. Prominent men of education, heritage, and wealth were suddenly made to bow their heads and choose their words carefully around a man who, not so long ago, had wandered Russia in filthy robes, begging for crusts of bread and spiritual guidance. Rasputin did not relish this political clout in the usual way. He did not throw grand dinners or seek titles. Instead, his influence came through a more insidious channel. His access to Alexandra Feodorovna, the empress, deeply devoted to her son, found in Rasputin not only comfort but a kind of sacred lifeline. She believed, truly believed, that he was a vessel for divine grace. That when Alexei bled, Rasputin's voice, his hands, his presence alone could draw him back from the brink. It is difficult to overstate the emotional weight of that belief. To lose a child is unbearable. To watch one suffer endlessly is a kind of slow spiritual dissolution. For Alexandra, Rasputin became something between a guardian angel and a final prayer made flesh. It was through this deeply personal channel that Rasputin's opinions flowed upward, influencing appointments, dismissals, and royal attitudes. Letters survive from Alexandra to her husband, the Tsar, in which she relays Rasputin's suggestions for ministerial posts, for military strategies, even for the handling of public sentiment. To some, this was a quiet catastrophe. A peasant mystic now shaped the empire's future, not through official edict, but by whispering to the Serena in moments of prayer to the public, who already bore the burdens of war and scarcity. The optics of Rasputin's power were unbearable. Satirical newspapers began printing grotesque caricatures of him, wild hair, demonic grin, often arm-in-arm with the empress. These images, which circulated in secret but with growing frequency, suggested seduction, corruption, black magic. In these crude sketches and whispered rumors, Rasputin was not just an advisor, he was a puppet master, a corrupter of queens, a devil in Cossack's clothing. And yet, if you returned to Rasputin's rooms on any given night, you might not find the grand manipulator the public imagined. You would see a man slumped in a chair, perhaps humming a church tune, surrounded by the smell of candle wax and unwashed linen. He wrote often long letters filled with religious imagery, dreams, fears, and cryptic guidance. He drank, sometimes excessively. He received visitors, some desperate for healing, others just curious. The duality of Rasputin is important. He was both more and less than his myth. At times he spoke of returning to Siberia, of leaving the court entirely. Let them destroy themselves, he once reportedly said to a friend. I am tired of being their fire. But he never left. Whether due to pride, faith, or the gravitational pull of power, he remained within reach of the Romanov, and the longer he stayed, the more enemies he acquired. Inside the Duma, the Russian parliament members spoke in thinly veiled terms about dark forces clouding the throne. Military leaders complained that strategy had been compromised. By superstition, even loyal monarchists began to murmur that the Empress's devotion to Rasputin had made her blind to the damage being done. A mystic could be a curiosity in peacetime. In wartime, he became a liability, and so, among certain nobles and statesmen, a decision took shape. A bitter, reluctant decision born from what they perceived as necessity. Rasputin had to be silenced, not exiled, but removed entirely, dead. One of the most vocal figures in this plot was Prince Felix Yusupov, a young aristocrat with vast wealth and a flair for drama. He was joined by Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, a member of the imperial family, and a few others, all determined to act in what they saw as defense of Russia itself. These were not revolutionaries or radicals, they were loyalists, or at least, they believed they were. But they had come to see Rasputin as the cancer at the heart of their dying empire. They did not speak of assassination in the abstract. They made plans. They acquired poison. They discussed pistols. They arranged the invitation. But before we reach that fateful night, pause for a moment and return in your mind to Rasputin's home, his humble rooms, lit by low candlelight. Somewhere within those walls, perhaps, he sensed the tide turning. Perhaps not, but history does not wait for awareness. It moves with or without us. The night of Rasputin's murder began, as many nights had for him, with an invitation. It came from Prince Felix Yusupov, a name Rasputin knew well. The prince was married to the Tsar's niece, a young woman of noble blood, and the family name alone carried enough weight to command Rasputin's attention. The message was simple. The prince's wife was feeling unwell, and she would greatly benefit from Rasputin's prayers and healing touch. Could he come to the Moika Palace that evening? Rasputin agreed. The winter was deep that December. Snow had hardened into crust along the streets, and a biting wind crept along the canals of St. Petersburg. Rasputin arrived at the palace shortly before midnight, bundled in a heavy coat, his beard rimmed with frost. The estate was quiet, dimly lit, the staff apparently retired for the evening. Yusupov greeted him himself and led him down into a basement room that had been prepared for the occasion. Here, in the cool stone chamber beneath the palace, the stage had been set. The room had been outfitted to look inviting. Patterned rugs on the floor, a table set with pastries and wine, and a phonograph playing faintly in the background. The other conspirators waited elsewhere in the house, some pacing nervously, others watching the clock. They had laced the wine and cakes with cyanide, a dose they believed would be more than sufficient. As Rasputin entered the room, he was at ease. He spoke casually with Yusupov, asked after his wife, sipped the wine, and nibbled at the cakes. Time passed. Minutes ticked by, then an hour, and still nothing. No sign of illness, no labored breath, no grasping of the chest or loss of consciousness. Rasputin laughed, talked, gestured. If the poison was working, it gave no outward indication. Yusupov, unnerved, excused himself and ascended the stairs to confer with his co-conspirators. According to accounts given later, accounts that vary in detail but not in conclusion, returned with a revolver in hand. When he came back into the room, Rasputin was standing, looking curiously at the prince. Yusupov raised the weapon and fired. The shot hit Rasputin in the chest. He collapsed onto the carpeted floor. Blood pooled beneath him, dark and quiet. For a time, the room was still. The conspirators believed the deed was done. They waited, spoke in hushed voices, made plans to dispose of the body before morning. But Rasputin did not remain still. Whether minutes passed or longer, the timing has never been certain. What is remembered is that Rasputin stirred. First a twitch, then movement, then unthinkably he rose to his feet. His eyes, those often eyes, were wide. He staggered, then rushed toward Yusupov and the stairs beyond. The prince screamed. Chaos erupted in the house. Another conspirator, Perishkovich, fired again, this time multiple times. Rasputin was hit again, falling once more. Eventually, the shooting stopped. Silence returned to the house, broken only by heavy breathing and the far-off crackle of the phonograph. The body was wrapped in cloth, bound, and carried out into the night. The assassins brought it to the frozen Malaya Nevka River, where a hole had been cut in the ice. Rasputin was dropped into the dark water below, disappearing from view. The exact sequence of events has long been debated. Autopsy reports, newspaper articles, letters, and memoirs each offer slightly different versions of what occurred that night. Some suggest Rasputin was still alive when he was submerged. Others claim he died from the gunshots. What is known is that his body was recovered days later, frozen and battered, and that his death was greeted not with solemnity, but with quiet. Relief in some corners of the court and jubilation in many parts of Russia. In the immediate aftermath, the conspirators believed they had saved the monarchy, that, with Rasputin gone, the imperial family could reclaim its dignity, its distance from scandal, its hold on the people. But the opposite proved true. Alexandra was devastated, seeing his murder not as justice, but as sacrilege. She became more isolated, more withdrawn, and with Nicholas at the front lines of war. Her decisions in court matters grew increasingly erratic. Rasputin had been many things to many people: a prophet, a fraud, a friend, a threat. In death, he became something else entirely, a symbol. To the Tsarina, he was a martyr. To the revolutionaries, proof of the corruption at the empire's core. And to the world beyond Russia, he became legend. In the weeks following Rasputin's murder, St. Petersburg remained cloaked in deep snow and deeper uncertainty. Official investigations were sparse and carefully managed. The imperial family did not publicize the crime, nor did they seek open justice for it. After all, the perpetrators included members of the nobility men who still dined at court, who carried titles and estates, and whose motives, however violent, were rooted in preserving the monarchy itself. The Tsarina, however, was inconsolable. Alexandra's grief was profound and private. Rasputin had been, to her, not only a spiritual guide and healer, but one of the few people in her world who seemed to truly calm her turbulent thoughts. Without him, her isolation grew more severe. She began to withdraw further from court society, relying on ever smaller circles of advisers. Some letters she wrote in the aftermath were filled with sorrow, others with barely veiled anger at those she suspected were behind his death. The burial of Rasputin was handled quietly, but not without ceremony. He was first interred at Tsar Silo near the imperial residence. The funeral, though not widely attended, included members of the royal family and a few loyal followers. The grave itself was not grand, just a modest resting place, but it represented, for Alexandra, a spiritual anchor. She reportedly visited the site multiple times in the months that followed, but this quiet was deceptive. Russia itself was no longer still. The First World War was ongoing, and its strain on the empire was growing unbearable. Food shortages had worsened. Public unrest simmered dangerously in the cities. Trust in the monarchy was eroding rapidly. Many saw the influence Rasputin held over the royal family as a symptom of something deeper, a rot within the leadership, a blindness to the people's suffering, and in this way Rasputin's legacy took on a different tone. His name, now disconnected from his physical presence, became a rallying point for those who wanted to see drastic change. Revolutionary pamphlets depicted him as a symbol of aristocratic decadence, of mystical nonsense, of corruption gone unchecked. In reality, Rasputin had little to do with military decisions or economic policy, but perception, especially in politics, is often more powerful than truth. 1 year after his death, the monarchy fell in early 1917, a series of protests and strikes swept across Petrograd as St. Petersburg had been renamed. The Tsar, still away at the front lines, issued orders for the unrest to be put down. But the soldiers refused to fire on the crowds. Power slipped from imperial hands almost without warning. The Duma declared a provisional government. Nicholas II abdicated shortly after. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled for over 300 years, came to an end. In the chaos that followed, Rasputin's grave was not spared. Revolutionary soldiers, believing his tomb to be a site of monarchist reverence, exhumed his body and destroyed it. The exact details remain unclear. Some say his remains were burned, others claim they were reburied anonymously. What is known is that no physical trace of Rasputin survives today. His body, like the empire he became entangled with, vanished into the storm of revolution. But stories linger. Among the people, legends about Rasputin persisted long after his death. Some claimed he had prophesied the fall of the Romanovs. Others believed he had cursed those who betrayed him. There were tales of his spirit wandering the halls of the Winter Palace, of dreams in which he appeared to those who had known him. These stories, though unverifiable, became part of his legacy's strange echoes that refused to fade. Historians in the decades that followed tried to pass the man from the myth. They examined his letters, his speeches, the testimonies of those who met him. Some found evidence of a sincere spiritual figure caught in circumstances far beyond his control. Others painted him as a manipulative opportunist, skilled at exploiting power. Most agreed, however, that Rasputin was neither holy saint nor sinner, but something more ambiguous, a product of his time, his environment, and the people who projected their hopes and fears onto him. Even today, more than a century later, Rasputin remains a figure of fascination. His name conjures images of hypnotic eyes, candlelit rooms, whispered secrets, and a world teetering on the brink of collapse. He has been the subject of novels, songs, films, and countless scholarly studies. Yet despite this, or perhaps because of it, he remains elusive. The man at the center of the storm, obscured by myth, distorted by time, and still, in some quiet part of the Russian imagination, he walks. Not as a villain or a hero, but as a shadow across the snow, in the years following the revolution. As the Russian Empire gave way to civil war and eventually to the Soviet Union, the name Rasputin fell out of favor in official histories. The new regime, determined to distance itself from the mysticism and monarchy of the past, painted Rasputin as a symptom of imperial decay. In state propaganda, he was portrayed not just as a dangerous figure, but as proof of the Romanovs' unfitness to rule a superstitious peasant granted far too much influence, a sign of spiritual rot. But even as textbooks omitted him or reduced him to a caricature, whispers remained. In remote villages, in quiet households, the older generations still told stories. Stories of a wandering holy man who could calm fevers, still bleeding, see what others could not. They did not always name him, but the echoes were clear. In some places his name was spoken in reverent tones. In others, it was a warning, a ghost of old Russia. Outside of Russia, interest in Rasputin only grew. Writers in Europe and America seized upon the mystery of his life. Sensational books were written. Some described him as a sorcerer, others as a charlatan. Photographs of his piercing gaze were printed in newspapers and magazines. Over time, he became less a man than a mythic archetype and image used to explore the dangers of unchecked influence, the seductive pull of the occult, the frailty of power. Yet, when you peel away the layers of speculation and legend, a quieter truth remains. Rasputin was born into poverty, lived much of his life on foot, and died violently. He did not hold office. He did not command armies. He wrote no manifestos. His power came not from position, but from presence. He was someone whom people believed in, sometimes desperately, sometimes foolishly, but with real conviction. That, perhaps, is the most enduring mystery of all. Imagine now, not the storm of politics or the chaos of war, but the man alone, walking through snow under a leaden sky, resting at a monastery gate, boots muddy from the road, speaking in low tones with a farmer or a priest or a mother cradling her sick child. His hair is long, his coat worn, his fingers calloused. He is tired, but he listens. He places a hand on a shoulder. He whispers a prayer, and then he moves on. In the end, Rasputin may be less an answer than a question. What draws people to those who seem touched by something greater? Why do we turn to mystics in times of fear? What do we seek in those who speak not with logic, but with faith? As you rest now, let those questions drift like snowflakes light, slow, and without need for resolution. The world Rasputin walked through is gone. The empire has crumbled. The palaces are silent. But the story remains, like a lantern flickering in a darkened corridor, a strange, quiet light that refuses to go out. And so, we end this journey not with certainty, but with calm. Let the images soften the snow-covered village, the candle-lit chapel, the hush of a palace room at night. Let them fade gently as sleep approaches, and the past recedes into stillness. Good night.